So in relation to the question on Arab states, so there's a disjunction between the people and the state, and Arab governments are not representative of their states. Most of us live under dictatorships, and our problem is actually innately within that. And it's really also important to understand that from our perspective, we see the Israeli project as inherently an imperial and neoliberal project that has affected and shaken the security of the region and facilitated also the long survival of dictatorships in the area, because that tension was being exploited by different imperial powers which seek to serve their position. So Al-Sisi, Abdullah, they are not representative of what people on the ground. And you can see hundreds of thousands of people on the ground seeking to speak out their position, but not being heard. So the people of the Arab states have a very different position. However, also there is this very big fear that once again, the position of Arab states is to be a place to displace the Palestinians, as has been happening. And now we stand at the horrific fear of the people of Gaza being displaced into the desert of Sinai. That is very traumatic for me, very dramatic for the millions of people, not only Palestinians, but Arabs, who have seen this happen and again and again. So it is very important also to keep that caveat in mind and the asymmetry of power in which we all exist and are functioning. So meanwhile, Haggai noted that the 7th of October replaying on TV, it's actually a tactic by Israeli powers to keep on re-traumatizing the population. And as Noemi Klein recently reminded us in a podcast with Jewish Currents, that re-traumatization is blinding. And they are playing this re-traumatization as a notion. And it was used the same during a Nakba, which is using the re-traumatization of the Jewish people over and over again to blind them towards an actual ongoing traumatization. So it's actually weaponizing the trauma of people and not allowing grief to take its place in relation to healing, but to take its place in relation to blindfolding us towards facilitating. So it's weaponized forms of re-traumatization. As per the question of the use of international law, so international law is a very, very tricky place to exist. However, let's say there's a difference between my work as a lawyer and the work of a politician. I've sat down with a lot of lawyers in the past few weeks, a lot of politicians, and they always talk to you about party politics as their primary issue. Me as a lawyer, I have to talk to you. Justice is my prior issue, is my most important issue. So it's about ingraining the language of justice and actually trying to ingrain a reading of international law that is premised on the notion of justice, not a positivist reading that actually takes in and forgets to understand that also the history of international legal making is inherently politicized. However, in international law, I can come up and tell you, yes, we are seeking justice. And it's a breaking point. I always tell my students, it's the insecurity of international law, because the legitimacy of this system stands on a higher claim to international justice. So we must also shame international law for its lack of adherence to that ideal of justice, but at the same time be very wary when people are using the language of international law in a form of lawfare to be split on the hairs of this interpretation and that word being said by that state, rather than thinking of the spirit of that, which is again humanity standing after the Second World War and saying never again for all of us equally. And I left this to the last bit, which is in relation, and I've seen a lot of people discuss here, the concept of the right of resistance. And this is a time of a lot of confusion. And sadly, we don't have our rights of freedom of speech protected in order to allow us to partake in this debate freely, to understand how is it, what is it that happened and what type of language are we using. So I will just opt to giving you the international legal answer to this. People have the right of resistance against a grave illegality in international law. That is something that is inherently premised in international law in the state practice in relation to previously colonized states. That right we can establish. However, in international law, and as kindly noted by multiple members here, there is a very big difference about the existence of the right itself and then the conduct of hostilities. In the conduct of hostilities, all parties have to adhere to international humanitarian law with no differentiation No one is at any point allowed to target civilians. No one at any point is allowed to partake or look at life cheaply. That being said, also, we need to remind ourselves that we have been overly exposed to a language or to a way of thinking that overly scrutinizes the acts of non-state actors and actually is more likely to find virtue in the acts of states. When we translate that, and that is very long history of war theory, when we translate that, it is more, quote unquote, civilized to drop bombs over people, leading to hundreds of deaths, than it is to directly target civilians. Both acts are wrong, but we need to understand the asymmetry and the biases in the language that we have shaped. People have gone on and on and on in condemning one form of violence because it's direct, we can see the blood. However, there's another type of violence that is less represented in international media, and two, done with a desensitized manner, with the most advanced technologies on earth. I can drop it using AI targeted bombs, and actually Israel hasn't even bothered to use those expensive bombs. Most of the bombs it used were outdated, stocked up in its basements, and actually they've used the most indiscriminate of weapons in this. And so it's so justified by the idea that they want to reach all the way to the Hamas tunnels. So it means that they will murder everyone in the building. And actually these bombs are still not fit for purpose. So we need to keep this in mind. And last but not least, we all need to remember very important words. And from the history of the Israeli strategies, Israel has something called the Hannibal Directive, which is the policy of targeting its own civilians, its own people as a preferred option, rather to them being held captive by enemy forces. And that is something that it's a military strategy that has existed. Another very important military strategy is Al-Dahiyah Doctrine. Al-Dahiyah Doctrine was used in 2006 against civilian neighborhoods in Lebanon. And the whole point of it was to cause as much civilian damage as possible in order to let the armed groups secede, and in order to pressure the armed groups by causing as much civilian damage. These are proved doctrines. These policies have been discussed even in UN halls. So we need to keep in mind that that is the military of which we speak. These are the policies of the military that economically advanced states are shaking hands with. And we need to keep in mind that Western states, the US and the UK, when they shake hands with Israel, it is for a very specific reason: economic and political interest, nothing more, nothing less. They are shaking hands with one of the bloodiest regimes ever seen. History will once again look at this moment in absolute shame. The same moment and the same spirit with which the UK supported the apartheid South African regime. We're going to look back in history and say those who stay silent are forcibly going to be pushed to shame for the rest of their lives, because we saw this happen. I will finish on this, and I apologize, I've said. Iris Marion Young, who's one of my favorite philosophers, always reminds us that we need to understand our positioning to each and every cause. And when we look at the cause of the Palestinian people, they are left in absolute ethical loneliness. They have every interest and they can perceive very clearly of all the pain and agony. And they actually always say that between us and the Israeli people, there is mountains and generations and decades of trauma and blood and oppression and deletion of history. And we need to understand that from the other side, there's people with privilege and capacity to change that, towards that. And we all need to look very clearly at our positioning in relation to that. What is my capacity and privilege to save people who have been left out of their voice through multiple layers of domination, not just one? We stand at a pivotal moment in humanity. And to be honest, as a person who has lived through this, I've never been under the direct risk of being bombed. But as a person who's been indirectly traumatized by this across generations on and on again, I can tell you that there is no way for me out of this historically, unless this was the historic changing moment where the liberation of the Palestinian people started, where the world woke up and where the world started speaking truth to power and started to see things for what they are and humanize everyone equally. Thank you.